Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goats are of the land and fish are of the sea. But goat versus fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? Meh. Do you be goat or a fish? Boom, 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 boom. Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Now repeat, repeat after goat versus fish. Dooby 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 a dooby goat, dooby goat, dooby goat, dooby goat, or dooby fish, a dooby goat or a fish, because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Well, goat versus fish came up to me and said, a goat or a fish, which one do you be? Do you be goat or a fish? 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 Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence. Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. The medieval fence sitter sits on the fence. But the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish. Do you be goat or a fish?
Make some noise for the goat. Make some noise for the goat.
Goat versus fish.
Make some noise for the goat. Celebration of Thunder Checks. Welcome to
Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish.
Versus. This is the current versus.
Goat versus fish. Celebration. Celebration, yes, goat and fish. Celebration for goat versus 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 fish.
Celebration.
Celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Welcome to goat versus fish. Welcome to goat versus fish. Welcome to a brilliant and beautiful versus of goat versus fish. Oprah Williamson, welcome to goat versus fish. Psychic Buckeye subscribes to goat versus fish. Psychic Buckeye subscribes for 13 months to goat versus fish. We begin the verses with a subscription to goat versus fish. Oprah Williamson, are you goat or are you fish? Oprah Williamson, are you goat or fish? Psychic Buckeye, 13 months of goat versus fish. love to begin a versus. We love to begin a versus. With support for Goat vs. Fish, because Goat vs. Fish supports you so much that why not support Goat vs. Fish? But of course, Goat vs. Fish will always give more to you than you could ever give to Goat vs. Fish. That is just the giving verses of Goat vs. Fish. So generous is Goat vs. Fish, so benevolent is Goat vs. Fish. TR says fish, celebration for fish. TR the fish, make some noise for the fish. Make some noise for the fish. Fish, 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 fish. Fish, 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 yes, fish. Oprah Williamson says fish, celebration for fish, celebration for fish, 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 fish. You who are on the YouTube of Goat vs. Fish, subscribe to Goat vs. Fish, like the stream of Goat vs. Fish. Desiccator is in the verses on Twitch. Wow Mom is in the verses. Geode is in the verses. Celebration. JJ and Luca Games and Vlogs. Why hello Goat vs. Fish, 'tis I. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? That's the verses. That's the verses. That's the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Desiccator, yes. Fish, Gerard Farugia says fish. But we have a goat in the verses. JJ and Luca Games and Vlogs says goat. Celebration for Gerard the fish. Celebration for fish, celebration for fish. We have a fish in the verses, we have a fish in the verses. Yes, we're just beginning the verses of Goat vs. Fish, and we're doing our declarations of goat and fish. We're doing our declarations of goat, fish, Goat vs. Fish, like this. Like this. Like, Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish. Like this. Fish, 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 Oprah Williamson. Fish, fish, fish. You want to see some fish? You want to see some fish? We'll show you the fish. Look at the fish. Look at the fish. Look at the fish. Look at the fish all around Goat vs. Fish, surrounding Goat vs. Fish. The fish that surround Goat vs. Fish in a beautiful and mighty verses. I'd like to thank this fish. I'd like to thank this fish. I'd like to thank this fish. This is hilarious. Yes, Oprah Williamson, this is hilarious. This is the mightiest verses you have ever seen. This is the mightiest verses. It's the verses of your dream. It's the verses of your dream. You have come along, verses from YouTube. Can I see the goat? Can you see the goat? Can you see the goat? Can you see the goat? Can I see the goat? Said the fish to Goat vs. Fish. Stephanie Bunny, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Año has chosen goat. Año has chosen goat. Let's get a goat in the verses. Who wants to see the goat? Make some noise if you want to see the goat. Make some noise if you want to see the goat. Goat vs. Fish. We're not fencing around here. If you want to see the goat, then we want to hear that you want to see the goat right here, right now in this verses. Stephanie Bunny. Like the stream. Subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. Don't swipe away. We have a million verses. We have a million verses. Stephanie Bunny says goat. Stephanie Bunny says goat. Thunderhead81 says goat. Let's see that goat. Let's see that goat. Goat. Oh, celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Let's see that goat. Let's see that goat! Goat in the verses! You want to see that goat? We've got goat. We've got goat. We've got goat. Look at the goat. Look at this goat. Have you ever seen a goat quite like this? Pectoral goat. Strong pectoral goat. We thought pecs were just for pectoral fins, but no. Goats have pecs too. Goats have pecs too. And that's not the only goat. There's another goat. There's another goat in the verses. Make some noise for big goat. We know what you want to see. You want to see big goat. You want to see the big goat. You want to see the big goat. You want to see the huge goat. Celebration for goat, 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 giant goat, giant goat, giant fish. Fish, fish. Smash says fish. Smash says fish. Wow Mom says goat. This is Goat vs. Fish. Rah! Goat vs. Fish grows larger and more powerful with each passing verses, with each new subscription to Goat vs. Fish. With each new like of the stream of Goat vs. Fish, Goat vs. Fish grows ever more powerful. Some may say Goat vs. Fish is this all there is to Goat vs. Fish, and Goat vs. Fish will say yes! Goat vs. Fish is all that there is, and all that there is a goat and a fish. Where did you get this? Where did you get this? This versus this goat? Do you mean the goat or the fish? Or do you mean Goat vs. Fish? Oprah Williamson, you get a goat, and you get a fish, and you get a goat, and you get a fish, and you get Goat vs. Fish, and you get Goat vs. Fish. I love this. I also love Goat vs. Fish. You haven't even witnessed the beginning of Goat vs. Fish. There's so much Goat vs. Fish that you have yet to even comprehension, You're just beginning your first lesson of Goat vs. Fish, your first lesson of Goat vs. Fish. The goat, the goat. The goat. Welcome to Lachtanu Bracha. Whatever the verses that means to Goat vs. Fish, who follows Goat vs. Fish on Twitch celebration. Well, Mom made the goat. There is one who follows Goat vs. Fish and who has been part of the congregation of Goat vs. Fish for at least 7 million verses. And they made the giant goat by their own hooves. They formed the goat. And then they gifted it to Goat vs. Fish. Oprah Williamson subscribed. Stephanie Bunny. Oprah Williamson, you subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. We got a new YouTube subscriber, Goat and Fish. We think you deserve versus a song of Goat vs. Fish. Don't you, Goat and Fish? For a new subscriber to Goat vs. Fish? For a new subscriber to Goat vs. Fish?
Goat or fish! 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 Goat or fish!
Don't do it, Bill. Don't do it, Bill.
Look out, God!
No! No! No, do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. Do not be deceived by fence sitters. 1, 2, 3, 4. How's the verses? 1, 2, 3, 4. Fish here. Adam S says Fish here. Will you be live tomorrow? Goat vs. Fish does not know. Perhaps we will be live tomorrow. You never know when Goat vs. Fish is going to be live, but that is why you can follow Goat vs. Fish on all social media at Goat vs. Fish. Why you can on all social media at Goat vs. Fish. Stephanie Bunny, don't go just imitating everything that you hear. Just say Goat vs. Fish. Just choose Goat or Fish. Are you going to be swayed by every common fence sitter that claims to be something that's not a goat or a fish? Surely you are more intelligent than this. Surely you are more intelligence. Kel Circle, welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Spinning verses. Classic spinning verses. Classic spinning verses of Goat vs. Fish. Classic spinning verses. Let me get this verses of Goat vs. Fish. For the new, they are new to Goat vs. Fish. They deserve verses. Only the true verses. They deserve verses. They deserve verses. The verses. They deserve verses. The verses. So let's give them the verses of Goat vs. Fish. The verses of Goat vs. Fish. And now, the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Are you American? Are you American? Are you American? They ask Goat vs. Fish. Are you American? They ask Goat vs. Fish. Are you American? They ask Goat vs. Fish. Well, if you're going to ask that to Goat vs. Fish, then we'll just Goat vs. Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Fish versus Goat. Goat versus Fish. And the goat and for goat versus fish. And the goat of the land and the fish of the sea. The goat and the fish are within you and me. Oh, see how that fence sitter sits up there upon the fence. But the land and the sea are for goat versus fish. How long have you been live? Oh, in the beginning there was goat versus fish. In the beginning there was goat versus fish, the goatfish, and goat versus fish said that there should be goat, that there should be fish. How long will you be live? Oh, for just a few more verses, just a few more verses. 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 Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is goat versus fish. And it is what it is. Goat versus fish, the mighty goatfish. Goat versus fish is goat versus fish. And the goat and fish versus. Goat versus fish brings the verses to you. We promise the verses we tell you are true. What's goat versus fish? You haven't a clue. But it is something to do. Do. It is something to do, and it comes from within you. Oprah Williamson has to go by. Why is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? Why a versus like this? Why can't goat and fish kiss? Why can't goat and fish kiss? Why can't goat and fish kiss? Why must they always versus? Goat are always versus the fish. The fence sitter pitiably sits on the fence. But it was written and it was wrote that goat versus fish and fish versus goat. If that doesn't make any sense, just please, please, please don't sit on the fence. Celebration, 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 oh, celebration. Oh, celebration for goat versus fish. Oh, celebration for goat versus fish. Howdy, Hazemaker 420. Howdy, Hazemaker 420. Combo meal, welcome back to Goat versus Fish. Welcome back to Goat versus Fish. Combination, combo meal goat, combo meal goat. Celebration, celebration for Goat versus Fish. A little musication of Goat versus Fish, a little musication of Goat versus Fish in every verses. A little musication in every verses. Yo, acoustications, yes. We thought we would bring back the acoustifications. It's also a lighter to Goat versus Fish. It's a lighter versus. It's a lighter versus. It's a lighter versus. A lighter versus for a brighter versus of Goat versus Fish. Raise your lighters, Goat and Fish. Tonight, we are goat, so we're gonna verse the fish. Fish, oh no! We're gonna verse that fish, Goat and Fish. We're gonna verse that fish. We're gonna verse that fish. We're gonna verse that fish. And speaking of Goat versus Fish, Blasphemous has come to pick Goat. Celebration. Pick the Goat. Pick the Goat. Many have asked Goat versus Fish, what are the names of the Goat and Fish? Goat versus Fish, we have been asked many verses, what are the names of the Goat and Fish? Then we say this is Goat and this is Fish. But what if their names were pick and choose? Wouldn't that be an interesting versus? What if this was pick the goat and this was choose the fish? It's pick the goat and choose the fish. That would be an interesting versus. Well, Mom, you're a great student of Goat versus Fish. What do you say to this versus? Pick the goat and choose the fish? For names for the goat and fish? I'm pick the goat. Pick the goat! And choose the fish. It's choose the fish. Pick the goat versus choose the fish. I like this versus. Pick the goat versus choose the fish. Well, Mom likes it very much. I also like it very much. Emily Scholes, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Gigantification, fish gigantification, giant fish, Stephanie Bear.
Do you be goat?
Ah!
Do you be fish? Do you be goat?
Pick the goat, choose the fish. Pick the goat. We have to make this written on Goat versus Fish. We have to make it written on Goat versus Fish. This is a critical versus. This is what we call a critical versus. Pick the goat versus choose the fish. We can't forget this versus. We can't forget this versus. Giant fish. Giant fish emote. You say giant fish. You spend 30 bits on giant fish, you get to gander at the giant fish. Okay, that's the verses. That's 30 bits of gandering at giant fish. If you want to gander at the giant fish again, then you just have to versus again for a Goat versus Fish. You just have to versus again for a Goat versus Fish. Oh, my verses! Nick Borsellino with 100 bits for Goat with 100 bits for Goat! Goat! Give me all your verses. I'm a greedy, greedy goat and I want all the bits. Celebration for Goat, celebration for Goat. Nick Borsellino with Goat, Nick Borsellino with Goat. Nick Borsellino with Goat. Bits of Goat versus Fish. We had this versus. Fence generation, oh generation. Generation fence. New verses, new verses. Pick the goat. Names for the Goat and Fish in Crown. It's pick the goat versus choose the fish. That's a nice versus. You see, Goat and Fish? Goat versus Fish. For many billions of years, Goat versus Fish has verses, and only now did we learn that their names are Pick the Goat and Choose the Fish. Desiccator says Goat is Penelope and Fish is Flounder. Nick Borsellino with 100 bits. Nick Borsellino with 100 bits.
Because the goats do be goat and the fish.
Glow stick. Are those foil gloves? Foil gloves, Goat and Fish? Oh, it is just part of the style of Goat versus Fish. It's just part of the new style of Goat versus Fish. Foils are for fencers. Foils are for fencers. You know fencers. Fencers and their foils. Ha! Repost Goat versus Fish. Repost Goat versus Fish on the social media of Goat versus Fish.
But the goat
So they are not foiling, no.
and the fish, do we fish? Do you be goat or
It is what it is. Glowstick, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Glowstick, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Glowstick, are you goat or are you fish? Foil is for baked potatoes. What kind of verses is that, Desiccator? What kind of verses is that? Potatoes. Are they goat or are they fish?
Welcome again to Goat versus Fish. Welcome again to Goat versus Fish. This shall be a mighty versus. This is the current versus. This is the current versus.
Goat or fish! 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 I choose! Look out, God!
Don't listen, don't be tempted. Don't be tempted, Glowstick. Oh, Glowstick and Bill Mansplainer of Green Jello, they all just love to be fence creatures. They all just like to be, I'm in charge of my own little verses, and I'm just a pluckety fence creature that just plays musications.
Oh, my versus.
We've seen it before. We've seen it before. Fence life, Glowstick. Glowstick going fancy, Glowstick going fancy. Glowstick is on the fence this versus. Glowstick is on the fence. Goat versus Fish. Do you have a versus of Vermin Supreme? A versus of Vermin Supreme? We do have a versus of Vermin Supreme. We have a versus of Vermin Supreme right in this versus. Goat versus Fish versus Vermin Supreme. Who's the true versus? You know it's Goat versus Fish. You know it's Goat versus Fish. So Glowstick is on the fence. Next verse is Yo Celebration Kel Circle. Are you goat or fish? We've got Twitch Aaron for goat. Twitch Aaron for goat. Celebration for goat. Glowstick, we must give you a verses of appreciation. Goat versus Fish was watching your vertical verses. On YouTube's. And Goat versus Fish thought, oh, are they just living streaming a vertical versus? And then Goat versus Fish went to kick.com/glowsticktv and we saw, you're doing a wide versus. You're doing a wide versus and a tall versus in the same verses. There must be a way to get the goat and the fish to verses in the same verses. And now Goat versus Fish has the verses of the goat and the fish. We have a vertical versus and we have a wide versus, simul versus. We appreciate this inspiration. Two camera verses. Oh no, is that what you say? No. No. Goat versus Fish is far more clever than this. Goat versus Fish is far more clever than this. Goat versus Fish is far more clever than this. Let's try this versus. Let's try Goat versus Fish. Let's try Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Yes. It's a fair enough versus. We have to do a bit more of this versus, but Goat and Fish. But for the sake of Goat versus Fish, this is versus enough. Oh, it's versus enough for Goat versus Fish. Look at this versus. Look at this versus. OBS plugin. We verse double the verses. We verse both verses in the same verses. We verse both verses in the same verses with Goat versus Fish. Ah! So yes, it is a multicam versus, but here on the living streams, of OBS, we can broadcast to a wide versus and a tall versus in the same verse. that's a tricky versus. Ooh, goat versus fish. Yes, goat versus fish, you are wise and mighty. You know all the tricks, goat versus fish. You know all the tricks. Goat versus fish knows every single versus of goat versus fish that ever did celebration. That ever did celebration on goat versus fish. Well, goat versus fish. We have to go back to this versus. Goat versus fish. Welcome back. Oprah Williamson is back on goat versus fish. Back in the versus celebration. We're not done counting the goat and fish. We're not done counting the goat and fish. Nick Borsellino with 100 bits for goat. Celebration for goat. Nick Borsellino with 100 bits for goat. Celebration for goat. Goat, 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 goat. Stephanie Bunny, are you goat or fish? Oprah Williamson, let's versus again. Are you goat or are you fish? You've come back to goat versus fish. Well, it's a whole new versus now, and it's time to choose again, goat or fish. Are you goat or fish? Desiccator goes goat. Desiccator goes goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Eldergrown goes goat. Celebration for goat. Another goat in the verses. Another goat in the verses. And Wow Mom the goat. Wow Mom the goat. A celebration for goat. Stephanie Bunny goat. Stephanie Bunny goat. Wow, this is a big goat versus. Where are all the fish? Where are the fish? Eldergrown. Celebration for goat. Eldergrown with 100 for goat. With 100 for goat. That's 200 for goat. J Stitch the fish. Fish in the verses. Fish in the verses. Celebration for fish. We got fish in the verses and celebration for fish. Desiccator with the celebration for goat. Oprah Williamson, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? Standard average fish. Standard average is fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Autumn Samurai fish. Autumn Samurai fish. That's another fish in the verses. That's another fish in the verses. Emily Scholl's fish. That's a fourth fish. That's a fourth fish. Fourth fish. Fine fish. Fourth fish. Fine fish. Cryptid 51, combo meal goat, celebration for goat, combo meal goat celebration. It's a combination, it's a celebration of combination. Hazemaker 420, are you goat or are you fish? Desiccator says, I pledge to versus the goat of the celebration of the verses, and to the goat for which we verse, one goat under the celebration for goats and fish for all. Celebration for goat versus fish. Some want to destroy goat versus fish. There are some who would wish to destroy the verses of goat and fish. This is the most critical verses of the universe. So please vote for goat or fish so we can continue the verses. Celebration 1, 2, 3, 4. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Adam S says fish. Fish to be counted. Celebration for fish. Checking in for fish. Checking in for fish. Checking in for fish. Stephanie Bunny is blooping even though they're a goat. They're mocking the fish. They're mocking the fish. Sun Unknown 96 goes fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Eldergrown goat. Giant goat. JJ and Luca Games and Vlogs. Goat. Celebration goat. Goat, goat, goat. And counting the goat and fish. Oprah Williamson says fish, 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 fish. Oprah Williamson did say fish in the verses, and so did Gerard Farugia, also said fish. Celebration for fish. That's 2 fish. 2 more fish. 2 more YouTube fish. And TR, the YouTube fish, also chose fish, so that's another fish. Psychic Buckeye 12 with the GOAT with 13 months of GOAT. That's GoatScription points, Goat and Fish, for subscribing to Goat vs. Fish. That's 1 for the verses, and for another 10 months, 13 months of Goat vs. Fish, double GOAT from Psychic Buckeye 12, the Psychic GOAT. The Psychic GOAT. Geode, are you goat or are you fish? You did not say if you were goat or fish. You just said, show us what you got, and you did not even say, show us what you goat. You did not even say, show us what you goat. Bearded Fish, Hazemaker 420. Ah, yes, of course, the Bearded Fish. Goat vs. Fish remembers the Hazemaker 420 Bearded Fish. Now this verse is, how could we forget the hazy bearded fish? How could we forget the hazy bearded fish? Scott from Canada, are you goat or are you fish? We'll ask you every verses. We'll ask you every verses. We'll ask you every verses. Scott from Canada fish. Scott from Canada fish. That's another fish. We have 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s fish, and 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s goat. But goat are leading in the bits, and goats are leading in the subscriptions of Goat vs. Fish. That's what's happening on Goat vs. Fish. That's what's happening on Goat vs. Fish. Polska Dot says, ooh, ask me. Polska Dot. Goat vs. Fish. We have to preparation. We have to preparation and asking for Polska Dot. Polska Dot needs to be asked one true question by Goat vs. Fish. When you're Goat vs. Fish, you really have to ask the one true question. It has to be a big versus. It has to be a very critical versus. They want Goat vs. Fish to ask, are you goat or are you fish? And it's a very special versus when we do, so we have to make it a precious versus for you. Polska Dot, okay, Goat and Fish. Okay, Goat and Fish. Polska Dot, we are ready to ask you the one true question. We're ready to ask you the one true question. Write this very verses. Write this very verses. The one true question of Goat vs. Fish. The one true question of Goat vs. Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? Okay. Polska Dot is fish, celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Me goat. Yes, Stephanie Bunny. Yes, Stephanie Bunny goat. Yes, Stephanie Bunny goat. We do not deny it. We do not deny it. That was satisfaction, appreciation. So Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. We have not yet received notification that Goat vs. Fish was on the Dr. Demento show this versus. After all that campaigning of Goat vs. Fish, we have still not heard if Goat vs. Fish. Let's find out if Goat vs. Fish was on the versus. Let's just do just a brief investigation, see if they made a communication with Goat vs. Fish. This very song you're hearing now, so much support for Goat vs. Fish, so much support for Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, Dr. Demento, Goat vs. Fish, Sopranos, the deleted scenes, everything you need to know. No, that's not the verses. Why did Christopher stare at the family? No, that's not the verses. Get 50% off jetpack value, press backup. No, that's not the verses. Your subscription will be renewing soon. That's not the verses. Your Twitch account successful login. That's not the verses. UPS store, mailbox closed. That's not the verses. Polska Dot says Unicrons are fish. Unicrons for fish, Unicrons for fish. Make some noise for unicorn fish, make some noise for the unicorn fish. Unicorn fish. Goat and Fish, we've got unicorn fish. You thought you were looking at fish, you thought you were looking at fish. You thought you were looking at fish, but who's the fish, but who's the fish? It's the unicorn fish, it's the unicorn fish celebration. Celebration for unicorn fish. Glorious verses. Glorious verses for fish. Big Rick 250 says, that's not a goat. A fish is not a goat. You are very wise in the ways of goat versus fish. Yes. Goat, celebration. Celebration. We have unicorns have been declared for fish. Polska Dot has declared unicorns for fish. That's 100 bits for fish. Big Rig, are you goat or fish? Elder Grown with 200 bits. Elder Grown says, fence that.
Because the goats do be goat and the fish do be fish, the...
Some say goat versus fish is just spam, but I am what I am, but I am what I am. 200 bits for the fence, 200 bits for the fence from Elder Grown, spamming what I am. Spamming what I am. Goat and fish, we are in a hype training, and goat versus fish is contractually obligation by the verses of goat versus fish as we read the verses here. We, goat versus fish, by obligation to goat versus fish, we must information you that during a hype training of goat versus fish live on Twitch, that you should share bits and subscribe to goat versus fish, and that if we reach 200 subscriptions on goat versus fish, then goat versus fish will give away a mug of goat versus fish, a shirt of goat versus fish, and also... What was the other verses? Was it goat or fish? A tote bag of goat versus fish. A tote of goat versus fish. A mug of goat versus fish. And a shirt of goat versus fish will all be verses if we reach 200 subs on goat versus fish. And we are at 164. Can we get more on goat versus fish? Crochet face. Oh, the crochet face of the fence hitter. Goat tote. Totes my goats. Tote goat. Tote, tote goat. Waste of space! I'm going to have to go with a solid fish tonight. You sick. Waste of space, you make me fish. You make me fish. Celebration for fish! Celebration for fish. Tote is goat, mug is fish. Well, you do drink like a fish out of the mug of goat versus fish. You do drink like a fish out of the mug of goat versus fish. Hey you, stop scrolling. Watch goat versus fish. That was just a versus for all of those of you on YouTube who just scrolled and saw goat versus fish and were thinking of swiping away to a different versus. But it's goat versus fish. And it's really a versus like you have never seen before, even though everything is goat versus fish. And you just don't realize that it's goat versus fish. Which is why you should chat to goat versus fish. Get to know goat versus fish. Get to know the one true verses of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish has declared and continues to declare goat and fish. We're going to build goat versus fish. Goat versus fish had a perception in recent verses. Goat versus fish had a vision. A vision of a great temple to goat versus fish. A great temple to goat versus fish. And the return of the services, and we mean a proper temple to goat versus fish. This verse is here, this verse is this liminal space of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, in your perception, in the interwebiverse, floating about the universe, goat versus fish. But goat versus fish needs a place of goat versus fish, where goat and fish from around the verses can come and to join goat versus fish, and to have a services. And goat versus fish was just wandering about the universe last verses, and goat versus fish found the perfect place for the first temple of goat versus fish. The first temple of goat versus fish. And so once we have funded the giant chalkboard on wheels, goat and fish, once we have funded the giant chalkboard on wheels, then we're going to start funding the temple of goat versus fish. And we're going to improve on that versus every verses. And when you come to the fair verses of Los Angeles to see goat versus fish, then you can come to the temple of goat versus fish. And you can worship goat versus fish. And you can pray to goat versus fish. Or you can just enjoy the celebration. You can just enjoy the celebration. All those sorts of verses that you have all been wanting to do for goat versus fish. Well, the very demure goat versus fish. Celebration, Elder Grown with the gifted verses. And standard average with 123 bits, and standard average with 123 bits. Celebration. Standard average, are you goat or are you fish? Have a bacchanal, have a bacchanal. Hype training, Elder Grown with 4 gifted verses. Elder Grown with 4 gifted verses. Elder Grown with 4 gifted verses. And the 1 gifted verses. And standard average with 123 bits. And standard average with 123 bits. Standard average for the fish, standard average for the fish. So we will build a mighty temple of Goat versus Fish. Make your pilgrimage to Goat versus Fish. Make your pilgrimage to Goat versus Fish. That's 223 bits for the fish. An Elder Grown with 5 gifted verses. With 5 gifted verses. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s gifted verses. 5 gifted verses. Celebration for Goat, celebration for Goat, Elder Grown with the 5 gifted verses. Combo meal. Imagine Goat and Fish, imagine Goat and Fish. You walk into the temple of Goat versus Fish and there's a statue of a goat and there's a statue of a fish. And there are places to sit, there are places to sit that are not on the fence, that are not on the fence. And then we light the verses, we light the verses. We light the verses and we all gather round Goat versus Fish. We all gather round Goat versus Fish and we are singing you a verses of Goat versus Fish as you enter the verses, as you enter the verses. And then you get a verses of Goat versus Fish. We tell you the verses, we tell you the verses. We verses a bit about the goings on about the goat and fish. Yes. And then we ask, are you goat or fish? We ask, are you goat or fish? And we make it written who is goat and who is fish here at this verses, here at this celebration. All in the congregation are asked if they are goat or if they are fish. All in the congregation are asked, are you goat or are you fish? They rise for Goat versus Fish. They come before Goat versus Fish. They choose Goat or Fish. OG Vandersnoot Fish, OG Vandersnoot Fish. And then we enjoy some meditation of Goat versus Fish. We enjoy some meditation of Goat versus Fish. We sing a song of Goat versus Fish. OG Vandersnoot Fish. Elder Grown with 5 gifted verses. Elder Grown with 5 gifted verses. That puts us, Goat and Fish, at 169. Goat and Fish, 169. Sensual verses, standard average fish. Standard average fish. And then we have a sing an ode to Goat versus Fish. We all sing along with Goat versus Fish. You can kneel at the statue of Goat. Does the temple sit on the fence? Of course the temple's not on the fence. But yes, you can kneel before Goat, you can kneel before Goat if you wish. And then after the services of Goat versus Fish, invitation you into the place of Goat versus Fish, and we can enjoy some communion with Goat versus Fish, maybe some light inebriation, maybe some consumption of Goat and Fish. Yes, and some musications, and we can all relaxation and celebration together with Goat versus Fish. And you say, wow, it's just like Twitch, but the Goat and Fish, they are here before me. I can see the Goat and Fish. I can maybe even feel the Goat and Fish. And they're all here together with Goat versus Fish. That is why you are all here with Goat versus Fish. You are the congregation of Goat versus Fish. Congregation! Goat versus Fish had pondered this, and Goat versus Fish referred to the Goat and Fish as the community of Goat and Fish, but this didn't quite verses with Goat versus Fish. And we thought celebration, congregation, Goat and Fish. You are the congregation of Goat versus Fish. The congregation, a gathering of Goat versus Fish. The Goat and Fish congregate together so they can verses. The congregation to the congregation of the Goat and Fish. The Goat and Fish verses. The Goat and Fish verses, a facilitation of Goat versus Fish. And oh, there shall be denunciation for the fence sitter. Oh, Goat versus Fish in the temple of Goat versus Fish. There will be some denunciation of fence sitters. Oh, believe Goat versus Fish. Some verses will be big celebrations of Goat and Fish. Some celebrations will be, Goat and Fish, Goat versus Fish, such a pleasant verses. And other verses will be a denunciation of the fence creatures. Get off the fence and choose Goat or Fish, lest you be fancy for the remainder of your verses. You'll be on the fence for all the universe and timing of goat versus fish. If you die on the fence, should you die on the fence, never having chosen goat or fish, then forever, 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 with pointy fence posts poking you in your posterior. Choose goat or fish, lest ye be fenced, lest ye be fenced. Oh, so we'll have that kind, we'll have big angry verses of goat versus fish and denunciation fence creatures. But we'll, of course, have celebrations for goat and celebrations for fish. Oh, my verses. Hype training, completion, goat and fish. Make some noise. Oh. Goat versus fish. It's going to be a brilliant and beautiful verses. Hype training completion. Hype training completion on goat versus fish. Hype training completion on goat versus fish. Appreciation, appreciation. So by all verses, goat and fish. But if goat and fish, if we can't fund the giant chalkboard on wheels of goat versus fish, how in the verses are we going to fund the temple of goat versus fish? Goat versus fish. We humbly ask for your contributions to goat versus fish. For the love of goat versus fish, make a small verses. Just make a small verses to goat versus fish. Oh, there will be donations to goat and fish at the temple of goat versus fish. Oh, you can make offerings to goat versus fish. Jozilla with the fish for 20 bits. 20 bits for fish, 20 bits for fish. Jozilla with a huge 20 bits for fish. Jozilla has answered the verses of goat versus fish. Jozilla has answered the verses of goat versus fish with 20 bits. Celebration. Celebration for fish, Jozilla fish. Celebration for Jozilla fish, fish. Celebration for Jozilla fish, fish. Goat versus fish. Have you chosen goat or fish on this mighty versus? Oh, you know goat versus fish. You know goat versus fish. Jozilla fish, celebration for fish. 243 bits for fish. 243 bits for fish. Celebration for fish. Have we chosen fish? You mean choose the fish? You mean choose the fish? We have named the goat and fish. This is pick the goat and this is choose the fish. It's pick the goat and choose the fish, or is it choose the goat and pick the fish? Some verses they confuse goat versus fish. Pick the goat versus choose the fish. Ooh, usually we like to avoid this verses, but we're kind of experimentation, the blurry verses. My name is Blurry Verse, and are you goat or a fish? Choose the goat or the fish. Choose the goat or choose the fish. Pick the goat or pick the fish. Pick the goat or choose the fish. Choose the goat or pick the fish. Be the goat or be the fish. Be the goat. Be the fish. Or the fish. Fish or? You are fish? Are you fish? Are you goat or fish? The goat? Stephanie says the goat? This is the kind of intellectualization type conversation. Goat versus fish was having a conversation with a goat or a fish yesterday versus, and they said the goat versus fish. We said, goat versus fish is very stupid. And they said, no! They said, no, goat versus fish is not stupid. They said, anyone who thinks goat versus fish is stupid is stupid. They said to goat versus fish, celebration for Hogrim goat. And they said, anyone who thinks goat versus fish is stupid. That's what they said to goat versus fish. It is a test of your intelligence. Those who say goat versus fish is stupid. The stupidity, it comes from within you. It comes from within you. The stupidness comes from within you. OG Vandersnoot fish. OG Vandersnoot fish. OG Vanderfish. Big and small, it is all. Big and small, it is all goat versus fish. Yes. Big and small, it is all goat versus fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. The stupid is a symptom of fence, a symptom of fence. Dare to be verses, dare to be verses, dare to be verses, dare to be verses. And what about a musication video of Goat vs. Fish? What about a musication video of Goat vs. Fish? So many verses of Goat vs. Fish, but Goat vs. Fish was speaking to the radioactive chicken heads, those fence creatures, those fancy chicken heads. And they said to Goat vs. Fish, oh, we have billions and billions of unreleased verses of Goat vs. Fish. We have billions of unreleased verses, and Goat vs. Fish thought, the radioactive chicken heads of course have more unreleased verses than even Goat vs. Fish. Because they're fence sitters and Goat vs. Fish is Goat vs. Fish. Release the verses, release the verses. Release the verses. Appreciation for Eldergrown with the subscriptions to Goat vs. Fish. With the subscription to Goat vs. Fish, we are at 169. We are 31 subscription away from 200 for Goat vs. Fish. Glorious celebrations. Glorious celebrations. Goat vs. Fish. We saw some news in the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Some new verses. Dr. Demento Show. Lowest episode for your verses. November 2nd, 2024, top 10. In this verses, we have the top 10 for October's for several vintage verses. Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. We want to know if Goat vs. Fish is in the top 10 of the verses. Is Goat vs. Fish in the top 10 of the verses? Is Goat vs. Fish in the top verses? Goat vs. Fish. The fence sitter sits on the fence. Goat vs. Fish at Goat vs. Fish. Play a verses, play a verses. Play a verses. We will have to see. We will have to see if Goat vs. Fish is in the top 10 of Goat vs. Fish. Old dirty goat fish, raw and uncut. Oh, raw and cut Goat vs. Fish, yes. We raw and cut Goat vs. Fish. Raw and heavily cut Goat vs. Fish. I will subscribe to you. Prince William Velasco wants to subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration! Celebration for Prince William Velasco will subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration, Prince. Celebration. The YouTube is starting to verses for Goat vs. Fish. We're getting some new subscriptions on Goat vs. Fish. We're getting some new YouTube subscriptions on Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish being the mighty verses that it is. Prince William Velasco, we appreciate your subscription to Goat vs. Fish, but Goat vs. Fish wants to know, are you fish or are you goat? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? 1,767 subscribers on the YouTube of Goat vs. Fish. We wonder if Goat vs. Fish looked at this versus Goat vs. Fish. The content of Goat vs. Fish. We are in a living verses. We are in a living verses. We look at the analytics of the living verses. Oh, my verses bailed in 420 with 20 months of Goat vs. Fish. Bailed in 420 with 20 months of Goat vs. Fish. Oh, it is not saying how many new subscribers we have received in this verses. We were wondering if we could actually perceive our subscribers to Goat vs. Fish. It is not saying that we are getting subscribers to Goat vs. Fish, but we'll give it a verses. We'll give it a verses. Bailed in 420. Bailed in 420 with 20 months of Goat vs. Fish. Celebration. Bailed in 420 now. This would be an interesting verses. Some of these verses bailed in 420. John Smith, hell yes, love it when this freaky dude is live. Welcome, John Smith, to Goat vs. Fish. John Smith, are you goat or are you fish? Some verses bailed in 420. Some verses bailed in 420. It's a disguise for Prue Lawrence. So if Prue Lawrence subscribes to Goat vs. Fish for 20 months under the verses of bailed in 420, is it a stolen verses? Is it a stolen versus? That would be a new versus on Goat vs. Fish. It was Bowden. Oh, my versus. We will have this conundrum on a future versus. Bowden for 20 with 20 months for fish. With 20 months for fish. And celebration for Bowden for 20 with 20 months for fish. Bunny Steel Stephanie, hi. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Fish. John Smith says, fish. We need more confidence than this. John Smith, more confidence. Are you goat or are you fish? Prue says, good idea for next time. Oh, my verses. I bought the subscription. Celebration. Wow, Mom is just purchasing all the verses. Wow, Mom, the providing goat. Wow, Mom, the providing goat. That's 20 months of fish. That's 20 months of fish subscription. So that's one for the subscription for fish, another for 10 months of fish, and another for 20 months of fish. You subscribe to Goat vs. Fish for 20 months. That counts for 3 fish. That counts for 3 fish. John Smith fish. Celebration for 20 months of Goat vs. Fish. As long as you maintain your consecutive verses. You see, Goat and Fish, when you have subscribed for 10 months to Goat vs. Fish, then your fish subscription points and your Goat subscription points, you get the bonus verses. And if you subscribe for 20 months to Goat vs. Fish, it counts for 3 verses. And if you subscribe 40 months to Goat vs. Fish, it counts for 5 verses. The longer you subscribe to Goat vs. Fish, the more powerful your verse is when you subscribe to Goat vs. Fish. John Smith, fish, celebration for fish, celebration for fish. Bowden 420 has earned their 3 verses, Wow, Mom, providing ammunition? That almost sounds like a political verses. Oh, my verses. Have you heard that Bowden 420's 20-month subscription for fish was funded by Goat? It was funded by Wow Mom the Goat. Big scandal in the politicalization versus of Goat vs. Fish. 20 months of subscription for fish have been funded by a mysterious goat. A mysterious wealthy goat is backing fish subscriptions in the versus of Goat vs. Fish. How can we trust our institutions when fish subscriptions are being backed by Goat? Secret goat vote. Some say that this is evident that fish are domination the verses because they are being funded by Goat. But Goat claim that Goat funding the subscription of fish is just a way to get more verses for Goat. It's because now the fish owes the Goat. Now the fish is indebted to Goat. So Goat, next thing you know, Goat is going to be saying to fish, those 20 months of subscription, it would be an offense if anything were to happen to your long subscription streak. Oh, we wouldn't want anything to happen to your subscription, fish, would we? Goat are scamming on the fish, says John Smith. Scamming on the fish, typical fish behavior, says Standard Average, says it's typical fish. Bunny Steel Stephanie, Goat, celebration for Goat. This is Goat. Oh, my verse is Goat. Elder-grown Goat. Bunny Steel Goat. Goat versus fish, the fish and the goat. The fish and the goat. More subscribers. We want more subscribers to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration. So let's have a look at this versus. Goat vs. Fish pondering. We know there was some news of Goat vs. Fish, or there was some kind of... There was that versus, there was that versus, there was that versus, there was that versus. That was a false versus. That was a versus, that was a versus. Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, Fishtober. Goat and Fish, we still have the Goat vs. Fish costume contest, Goat and Fish. Remember Fensoween? So far, Goat vs. Fish has received 1 submission to the Goat vs. Fish costume contest. If Goat vs. Fish has only received 1 submission to the Goat vs. Fish costume contest, then the 42 versus American dollars and a shirt of Goat vs. Fish will be won by default. And it will be a celebration for the one who triumphs. But until Goat vs. Fish announces judgment live on stream, you can still enter the verses. You can still enter the verses. If you want to win 42 versus American dollars, dress up as Goat vs. Fish. Just throw on any old verses. Throw on any old verses and call it Goat vs. Fish and submit it to Goat vs. Fish. Send it to the Instagram of Goat vs. Fish or on the Discord of Goat vs. Fish or an email to GoatVsFish@GoatVsFish.com. You need to get a crown so you can versus like Goat vs. Fish. You say this, but what if you went crownless as Goat vs. Fish? What if you went crownless as Goat vs. Fish? There are so many interpretations of Goat vs. Fish. You, Goat and Fish, when you think of the costume of Goat vs. Fish, you are thinking very, very narrowly about Goat vs. Fish. You could just take a picture of yourself and send it in and say, this is Goat vs. Fish. And your submission would be part of Goat vs. Fish. All perceive Goat vs. Fish differently. All perceive Goat vs. Fish differently. You could just be Goat vs. Fish. You could just be Goat vs. Fish. You could just be Goat vs. Fish. Articles of Goat vs. Fish. Ultimate Goat? Too hot to trout? Ah, well, we did that versus. Ah, election news. Dragon Balls 325, Goat vs. Fish. Fish, let's go. Celebration for Fish. Dragon Balls 325 has now fallen off the fence of the fancy goat and is now Fish and is now Fish. Is now Fish. Goat and Fish, Goat vs. Fish, there's so much contentment that needs to be made by Goat vs. Fish. The ever-expanding content of Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish, we believe the verses have come to, for the verses to come to a close because Goat vs. Fish has a verses that we must attend. But oh my verses, if we didn't show you this verses, we want to show you what's going on in the verses of politics here in Verse America. You say, Goat vs. Fish, why aren't you talking about the politicalization? Well, perhaps the verses has come to show you the state of Verse America, Goat and Fish, oh my verses. The state of Verse America, this verse is fancy indeed. Just look at these verses. Look at how offensive. Look at what's happening in Verse America. In this school election, it's pizza versus chicken nuggets with democracy as the winner. False versus. False versus. Is this what you call democracy in Verse America? Pizza versus chicken nuggets? As an exercise for the young Goat and Fish for their education? False versus. How about in this school's election, it's Goat versus Fish? With Goat vs. Fish as the winner. Celebration. Pizza versus chicken nuggets. Oh, how do we get the kids interested? Oh. Let's give them a false versus. How about you teach them about a true versus of Verse American democracy? Goat vs. Fish. A true versus of Verse American democracy would be Goat vs. Fish, not pizza versus chicken nuggets. Repulsive to Goat vs. Fish, repugnant to Goat vs. Fish. This is not the Verse America. Goat and Fish have fought and died for Verse America, and now this is what you are teaching in the School of the Fish? Our great 4 goats and 4 fish did not versus and perish so that pizza versus chicken nuggets could be taught in Verse America. Is this what your taxation, is this what your taxation is going to, Goat and Fish? Is this what your taxation is going to, Goat and Fish? Oh, the fence lord reaps your taxation so they can teach false verses, so they can teach demonstrably monstrous false verses in your education. That is why you should give your donations directly to GoatVsFish, to support the education of GoatVsFish, to support the temple of GoatVsFish.
Do you be goat?
What's on the lunch menu? Democracy. Goat and fish should be on the verses. Goat and fish should be on the verses. GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish. This verse is two false. Two false is this verses. Two false is this verses. Oh, my verses! Oh, my verses!
Sean Valshawn contribution $41.10 to GoatVsFish. Celebration.
Celebration! 41-10 to GoatVsFish. 41-10 to GoatVsFish. A huge versus. A huge versus. Sean Val. Sean Valshawn. Sean Valshawn. Sean Valshawn. Sean Valshawn, your Sean Valshawn is at hand. Your Sean Valshawn is here in GoatVsFish with 41-10 for GoatVsFish. 41-10 for GoatVsFish. But is Sean a goat or a fish? Is Sean Valshawn a goat or a fish? Is Sean Valshawn a goat or a fish? Is Sean Valshawn a goat or a fish with 41 verses? With 41 verses. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. Forties, ones, and 10. Celebration, celebration, celebration for Sean with 41-10 to GoatVsFish, to 41-10 to GoatVsFish, for 41-10 to GoatVsFish. 41-10 to GoatVsFish. But is it for goat or is it for fish, goat and fish? Is the 41-10 for goat or is the 41-10 for fish, goat and fish? Subscription for GoatVsFish, SeanKnight.com! SeanKnight.com! Returns to GoatVsFish! SeanKnight.com returns to GoatVsFish with a subscription for GoatVsFish! SeanKnight.com celebration! It's the long-awaited reverses of SeanKnight.com with 28 months for goat, with 28 months for goat! Celebration for goat, celebration for goat. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat. Goat, 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 goat. Goat, goat, goat! SeanGoat.Night has reversed the verses for 28 months of goat, for 28 months of goat, 1 month of goat, 2 months of goat. That's 3, counts for 3 goat description points, and 41, 41-10, 41, 10 for goat. Celebration! Celebration! Celebration. 41-10 versus closer. 41-10 versus closer to a giant chalkboard on wheels, goat and fish. You know you want it. You know you want that giant chalkboard on wheels, goat and fish. You know you want the giant chalkboard on wheels for the education of GoatVsFish. Education, education! When they are teaching chicken nuggets versus pizza to the younglings. We need the education of GoatVsFish now more than ever. We need the education of GoatVsFish more than ever. SeanKnight.com has to leave the verses. Give some celebration for SeanKnight.com. In honor of SeanKnight.com, GoatVsFish is going to give you a celebration. It's going to give you a celebration. It's going to give you a celebration. It's timing. It's timing for a celebration. It's timing for a celebration. You know the celebration. You know the celebration. You know the celebration. Celebration. We're no strangers to goat versus fish. You know the verses, and so do I. A full commitment's what I'm thinking of. You won't get this from a fancy fence-sitter. I just want to tell you how I'm versing. Got to make you understand. Are you gonna choose a goat? Are you gonna choose a fish? Are you gonna choose a goat or fish? Are you gonna choose a goat? Are you gonna choose a fish? Are you gonna choose a goat or fish? We've known each other so very long. Your heart's been aching, but you're too shy to say it. Inside we both know what's been going on. We know the verses and we're gonna play it. And if you ask me how I'm feeling, do not tell me you're too fancy to see. You're never gonna choose a goat. You're never gonna choose a fish. Never gonna choose a goat or fish. Never gonna choose a goat. Never gonna choose a fish. Never gonna choose a goat or fish. Never gonna choose that goat or fish, Fancy. Are you goat or a fish? Are you goat or a fish? Are you goat or are you fish now? Oh, Fancy, I just want you to choose goat or fish. I've never had a versus like this. I just gotta know. Never gonna goat, never gonna fish, never gonna goat, never gonna fish, never gonna goat, never gonna fish. We've known the verses for so very long. Your fence is breaking, but you're too shy to verses. Inside we both know what's been going on. You know the verses and we're gonna play it. And if you ask me how I'm versing, got to make you understand. Are you gonna choose a goat or are you gonna choose a fish? Are you gonna choose a goat or fish? Yes, are you gonna choose a goat or are you gonna choose a fish? Are you gonna choose a goat or fish? Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and fence you. Choose a goat, choose the fish. Never gonna tell a lie and sit on the fence. No, never gonna choose a goat. Never gonna choose a fish. Never gonna choose a goat or fish. I'm never gonna choose a goat. I'm never gonna choose a fish. Never gonna choose a goat or fish. Never gonna, no, no. Celebration. SeanKnight.goat with 4110 to goat versus fish. Tiger GD. Fenciness, are you goat or are you fish? Standard average celebration. Hogrim, yes, my verses. John Smith, brah, this dude just rickrolled the stream. Oh, my verses. This isn't. Clearly, this is, must be your first verses of goat versus fish. SeanKnight.goat. We knew SeanKnight.com never abandoned goat versus fish. Fish fam, Tiger GD with fish fam. Tiger GD with fish fam. Fish fam, fish fam, fish fam. Fam for fish, fam for fish, fam for fish. Okay, goat and fish, goat versus fish. Now we really have to versus. We really have to versus goat and fish. Goat versus fish. We have a space that goat versus fish must versus. There's a space that goat versus fish must versus. So let's go. Let's go, goat and fish. Let's goat and fish. In the current versus. Celebration, standard average celebration. So let's look at the verses. Let's look at the verses. Goat and fish, and let's make it written on goat versus fish. Make it written. Let's make it written. Let's make it written on goat versus fish. Do you be goat or do you be fish? And on this verses and on this verses. 11s, 2s, 24s, and on this verses of goat versus fish. And on this verses of goat versus fish.
Now repeat after.
Let's look at the verses. Let's count the verses. Fish. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s, 12s, 13s, 14s, 15s, 16s, 17s, 18s, 19 fish. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, 11s, 12 goat. 12 goat, 19 fish. That's a versus for fish. That's a versus for fish. It's a versus for fish. Subscription. It's a versus for goat. Subscription versus for goat. And with that donation of 4110 to goat, goat get the bits. Goat get the bits celebration and with Eldergrown with the celebrations. Goat. Goat take the verses. It's a triumph for goat. 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 The verses goes goat with goat of the verses going to SeanKnight.com. Gets goat of the verses. Eldergrown, you versed mightily, Eldergrown. You versed very mightily indeed. You versed very mightily indeed. As a matter of verses, if we comprehension goat versus fish. 6 versus American dollars per subscription to goat versus fish and 5 subscription to goat versus fish. This is a combined versus. SeanKnight.com gets goat of the verses, but we get an honorable verses. Honorable goat verses. Honorable goat verses to Eldergrown. Goat of the verses to SeanKnight.com. Honorable goat verses to Eldergrown. An honorable verses indeed. An honorable verses. An honorable verses. An honorable verses of goat versus fish. Goat and fish, this has been a brief but mighty verses of goat versus fish. And we appreciate your dedication to goat versus fish. Goat versus fish will continue to bring you goat versus fish. For all verses. The verses were rigged! Rigged! Speaking of that versus goat and fish, what do you suppose will happen? Goat and Fish, we'll give you one more versus. Goat versus Fish was doing
GoatVsFish versus.
just the scantest of investigation onto if Kamala versus Trump was Goat versus Fish. Just looking at whatever the defense, this little politicalization you have going on in your verses. We just began to ponder. Fence builder, we know, but is it Goat versus Fish? And oh my verses, this is but one week ago, this versus. So this is really some news in Goat versus Fish. This is some big news in Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish should do this versus. So we're going to show you now the evidence that has happened in Goat versus Fish. The evidence of what has happened in Goat versus Fish. Trump versus Harris is a false versus it is fence. Well, you may have supposed this, but what about this evidence? What about this evidence? Trumpy Trout becomes latest and strangest political gift that imagines the former president as a fish. Tiger GD says all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to remain fancy. Tiger GD, there is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. You know this. Trumpy Trout becomes latest and strangest political gag gift that imagines the former president as a fish. Oh, my verses. He's got big hair and a mouth to match. Trumpy Trout is the latest and strangest must-have political goo-gaw, an animatronic talking fish face that spouts off funny phrases with a distinctly Trumpian flavor. I'm building a new pond and the bass will pay for it, Trumpy Trout says. Plastic fins flipping back and forth. That doesn't sound like a fish. Why would the fish make the bass pay for the fish? Wouldn't the fish make the goat pay for the fish? I'm building a new pond and the goat will pay for it. That would be something a fish would say. Does this fish even know what it's versing about? Look at this fish. Look at the fish. That's an evidence for fish. Trump fish. Donald fish. Donald Trout? Has it been Donald Trout the whole verses? Have we been mispronouncing Donald Trump and it's actually Donald Trout? Trumpy Trout? Donald Fish? Look at the fish. Look at that fish. It does kind of, now that you verses it, it is quite fish. Donald Guppy? My fins are big, I have the biggest fins, no fish have fins like me. The $59.99 gag gift continues. Goat versus Fish, we might just have to purchase this versus Goat and Fish. We might just have to purchase this versus on Goat versus Fish. This might just be a critical versus. Fish, how are you going to do this versus now? Tyrus, 5 bits, celebration. Fish, what do you say to this fish? Do you count this fish among your fish? How does it feel that we have Donald Trout and not Trumpian goat? Celebration. Tyrus with 200 bits. Tyrus with 200 bits. My fins are big. I have the biggest fins. Some bass are bad fish, crazy fish, criminal fish, and druggy fish, but some bass are good fish, and I only love some of them. False verses! But then again, they say of the trumpety one that they just They just versus everyone and anything. So maybe this fish, maybe it's fish on fish violence on Goat versus Fish. Perhaps this Trumpian fish is just indiscriminately versing its own fish. I'm the biggest trout in the pond. There's no bigger trout than me, and there's probably never will be. Wow, it's like we don't even have to purchase this versus we can just imagination the fish. You can try to catch me, but it's hard. It's really hard. I don't eat just any worms. They have to be great ones, and they're shiny and nice. Only the great ones I plan to eat. Maybe Goat versus Fish should get this versus of the fish, and then we reprogramification for it to talk about goat. Fish in name only. Fino! Fino! Tires with 200 bits for fish. Tires with 200 bits for fish. Celebration for fish. We have to count every versus. Every versus will be counted in the verses of Goat versus Fish. Every verses will be counted in the verses of Goat versus Fish. Do we dare play the verses? Do we dare play the verses? Let's watch that verses, Goat and Fish. Let's watch the verses.
A message from the 45th President of the United Ponds of America.
Let's make fishing great again, okay?
He's here, everyone's favorite fish, Trumpy Trout.
No one has ever seen a fish like me.
Trumpy Trout is an animatronic talking fish with a big personality.
I am the hugely bigliest fish in the pond.
Watch his fins flap and his large mouth move as he makes speech after speech in high-fidelity sound.
Some bass are bad fish, crazy fish, criminal fish, and druggy fish. But some bass are good fish, and I only love some of them.
Mount him to your wall or use the built-in stand to display him proudly on your desk. Now you'll never miss a Trumpy Trout rally.
I'm building a new pond, and the bass will pay for it.
Set him to motion activated to surprise his fins.
Donald Trump, are you goat or are you fish? Fence builders think they can just go fish at any verses? Build the fence, build the fence, build the fence, and now fish. And now fish. Well, we suppose that could be a segment of Goat versus Fish. We could just upload that versus to the YouTube. That's how we make content. That's how we make content on Goat versus Fish. That's how we make content on Goat versus Fish. How the hell did you get something that hilarious? Well, Goat versus Fish, they know, the Book of Faces knows that we're always looking for goat and fish, so it sends us goat and fish related content. Every verses. Tyrus with 200 bits, appreciation. Appreciation for Tyrus with 200 bits. And now it is timing for irradiation, Goat and Fish. Timing for irradiation. It's timing for irradiation. Appreciation for joining Goat versus Fish. Those of yous on the YouTubes, we'll see you next verses. Those of yous on the YouTubes, we will see you next verses.